I'm Isabella, 27, sitting alone at a corner table in Marcello's, an upscale Italian restaurant in downtown Bellmont, staring at a $37 dinner bill, while my parents' empty chairs mock me from across the white linen tablecloth. 20 minutes ago, my father Richard slammed his napkin down and stormed out, my mother Vivian trailing behind him without so much as a backward glance, leaving me stranded without my purse, my phone, or any way to pay for the elaborate meal they had insisted on ordering. The waiter keeps glancing over nervously, probably wondering if he's about to witness a dine-and-dash situation, while I sit here in my $200 dress, the one my mother specifically requested I wear to look presentable for what she called an important family discussion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But here's what they didn't know when they abandoned me like an unwanted child at a charity drop-off. I had something in my briefcase that would change everything. Something that would turn their petty power play into the biggest mistake of their entitled lives. You see, 3 months ago my parents had begged me to help them avoid foreclosure on their dream house in Willowbrook Estates, the same house they'd been lording over everyone for 15 years. The same house they used as leverage to control and manipulate every aspect of my life. In their desperation, they had signed over temporary ownership to me, trusting their reliable daughter to save them from their own financial irresponsibility. What they didn't expect was that their reliable daughter would reach her breaking point in the most spectacular way possible. Before I tell you exactly how I used their own house deed to pay for that dinner, and the nuclear fallout that followed, drop a comment letting me know if you've ever been abandoned or humiliated by family who thought they could treat you like garbage. And subscribe if you've ever been the family member everyone expects to clean up everyone else's messes, while getting zero respect in return. Because what happened next didn't just shock my parents, it shocked me too, and it completely changed the power dynamic in our family forever. The evening had started 3 hours earlier with what my mother called a special dinner to discuss Isabella's future contributions to the family. I should have known something was wrong when they chose Marcello's, the most expensive restaurant in Bellmont, the kind of place where appetizers cost more than most people spend on groceries. My parents, Richard and Vivian Ashford, had always been obsessed with appearances, but they typically only splurged on fancy restaurants when they wanted something big from someone. In this case, that someone was me, and what they wanted was bigger than I could have ever imagined. I arrived at exactly 7:00 p.m., as requested, wearing the conservative black dress my mother had specifically chosen during our shopping trip the week before. "You need to look successful but not threatening," she had said while critically examining my appearance in the department store mirror. "You know how your father gets when he thinks you're trying to show off." I had bitten my tongue then, just like I always did, swallowing the observation that my own mother seemed more concerned with managing my father's fragile ego than celebrating her daughter's accomplishment. My parents were already seated when I arrived, my father checking his expensive watch with theatrical impatience despite the fact that I was exactly on time. "Isabella, finally," he said, standing to give me the kind of stiff, formal hug that always felt more like a business transaction than parental affection. My mother air-kissed my cheek, careful not to disturb her perfectly applied lipstick, while scanning my outfit with the critical eye of a fashion inspector. "You look lovely, dear," she said, though her tone suggested she was mentally cataloging improvements that could be made. "I'm so glad you could make time for us in your busy schedule." The comment stung because it implied that I was the one who had been avoiding family time, when in reality, every interaction with my parents felt like walking through a minefield of criticism and impossible expectation. The first hour passed pleasantly enough, with my parents discussing their recent vacation to the Hamptons and my mother's latest charity committee appointment. I shared updates about my marketing consulting business, which had been thriving despite their constant predictions of failure when I'd left my corporate job 2 years earlier to start my own company. "That's nice, dear," my mother had said when I mentioned landing a major client. "But you know, stability is so important. Mrs. Henderson's daughter just made partner at her law firm. Now that's real security." It was my father who finally revealed the true purpose of our dinner, just as the waiter was clearing our appetizer plates. "Isabella, Your mother and I have been discussing your situation, he began, using the same tone he might use to discuss a problematic employee. We think it's time you started thinking more seriously about your future and your responsibilities to this family. I felt my stomach tighten, recognizing the familiar setup for one of their interventions. These conversations always followed the same pattern. They would identify something about my life that didn't meet their standards, present their solution as if it were the only reasonable option, and then act hurt and betrayed when I didn't immediately agree to their demand. What kind of responsibilities? I asked carefully, though I already suspected where this was heading. My mother leaned forward conspiratorially, as if she were about to share state secret. Well, darling, your father and I aren't getting any younger, and we've been thinking about legacy planning. The house in Willowbrook Estates has appreciated so much over the years. It's worth nearly $2 million now, and we want to make sure it stays in the family. That's wonderful, I said, genuinely meaning it. My parents had worked hard for their success, and they deserve to enjoy the fruits of their labor. I'm glad the house has been such a good investment for you. Oh, but that's just it, my father interjected, his voice taking on the excited tone he used when discussing business deals. We don't want it to just be our investment anymore. We want it to be a family investment. We want you to buy into the property, say a 40% stake for about. It would be a wonderful way for you to build equity while helping us with some immediate cash flow needs. The number hit me like a physical blow, $800,000. They were asking me to hand over nearly every penny I had saved, plus take on significant debt, to buy into a house that they would continue to live in and control. It wasn't an investment opportunity. It was a demand that I fund their lifestyle while getting nothing tangible in return. That's a lot of money, I said slowly, trying to process the magnitude of what they were asking. It's an investment in your future, my mother said firmly, and in our family's future. Besides, it's not like you're doing anything important with that money sitting in your savings account. This way you'll actually be building something meaningful. The dismissal of my financial goals and business plans was so casual, so complete, that it took my breath away. They weren't asking me to invest in the family home. They were demanding that I sacrifice my financial independence to subsidize their retirement dreams, and they were doing it over expensive pasta and wine, as if the fancy setting could somehow make their outrageous request seem reasonable. That's when the evening took a turn that would change everything between us forever. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To understand how my parents could abandon their own daughter at an expensive restaurant, you need to understand the toxic family dynamic that had been brewing for 27 years. My father, Richard Ashford, 59, was a real estate developer who had built his fortune by being ruthless in business and controlling at home. He was the kind of man who measured everything in terms of power and profit, including his relationships with his children. To Richard, love was transactional. You earned his approval by meeting his expectations, and you lost it the moment you dared to think for yourself. My mother, Vivian Ashford, 56, was a former beauty queen turned professional socialite, who had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of manipulation disguised as motherly concern. She had won Miss Bellmont County back in 1989, and never quite recovered from the reality that real life didn't come with a crown and sack. Vivian's entire identity was built around maintaining appearances and social status, which meant that everything her family did was viewed through the lens of what will people think. She had turned emotional manipulation into an art form, using guilt, shame, and conditional love as weapons to keep everyone in line. Then there was me, Isabella Marie Ashford, their only child and designated family disappointment. From the moment I could walk, I was expected to be a reflection of their success, a living trophy that proved their superiority to the world, but I had always been a square peg trying to fit into their round hole of expectation. While they wanted a compliant daughter who would marry well and produce grandchildren to show off at country club events, I had dreams of building something meaningful with my own hands. The pattern had been established early in childhood. When I was 8 and wanted to take art classes, my father enrolled me in junior business camp instead because creativity doesn't pay the bills. When I was 12 and made the honor roll, My mother's first comment was, "That's wonderful, dear, but you really need to work on your posture. Successful people don't slouch." Every achievement was minimized. Every dream was redirected toward their vision of what my life should look like. The dynamic only intensified as I got older. In high school, I wanted to study journalism and travel the world as a foreign correspondent. My parents steered me toward business school because it was practical and respectable. When I graduated summa cum laude with my MBA, they attended the ceremony but spent the entire reception telling people about their neighbor's son who had just bought his second investment property. Nothing I accomplished was ever quite enough, and everything I wanted was subtly discouraged as impractical or selfish. My younger brother Marcus, 24, had been the golden child until he decided to become a musician and moved to Nashville against their wishes. Since then, he had been effectively written out of the family narrative, mentioned only in disappointed whispers about wasted potential and artistic phase. Marcus's exile had taught me a valuable lesson. In the Ashford family, love was conditional on compliance, and the moment you stopped playing by their rules, you became invisible. This left me as the sole focus of their expectations, and the primary target for their manipulation. I had learned to navigate their demands by becoming a master people-pleaser, always trying to find the balance between maintaining my own identity and keeping the peace. It was an exhausting way to live, constantly calculating whether each decision would trigger their disappointment or approval. The irony was that by any objective measure, I was exactly the kind of daughter most parents would be proud of. I had graduated at the top of my class, built a successful consulting business from scratch, owned my own condo in the trendy Riverside district of Bellmont, and maintained financial independence without ever asking them for money. But because my success didn't fit their predetermined mold of what my life should look like, it was constantly minimized or dismissed. My consulting business, Ashford Strategic Solutions, specialized in helping small businesses develop marketing strategies and operational efficiency. I had started it 2 years ago after growing tired of the corporate politics and inflexibility of my previous job at Meridian Financial Group. The transition hadn't been easy. There were months of 18-hour days, countless rejections, and financial uncertainty that kept me awake at night. But I had persevered and built something I was genuinely proud of. My client roster now included a boutique hotel chain, 3 tech startups, and a nonprofit organization focused on literacy programs. Last month I had been featured in Bellmont Business Weekly as one of 30 under 30 entrepreneurs to watch. The article had highlighted my innovative approach to combining traditional marketing with social media strategy, and several potential clients had reached out as a result. But when I had excitedly shared the article with my parents, my mother's response had been, "That's nice, dear, but when are you going to settle down and give us grandchildren? Success in business is all well and good, but a woman needs a family to be truly fulfilled." My father had been even more dismissive. "Consulting is just a fancy word for being unemployed with business cards. When you're ready to get serious about your career, I have connections at several established firms." Their inability to see my achievements as valid had created a deep well of resentment that I had been carefully managing for years. I attended family dinners, remembered birthdays, and participated in holiday traditions, all while feeling like I was performing in a play where everyone else had a different script. The constant tension between wanting their approval and maintaining my own integrity had become the defining struggle of my adult life. The financial aspect of our relationship was particularly complicated. My parents had always used money as both a carrot and a stick, offering financial help when it served their purposes, and withholding it when they wanted to express disapproval. They had paid for my education, which I was genuinely grateful for, but they had also used that investment as leverage in every major decision I made afterward. "After everything we've invested in your future" had become the opening line of countless guilt trips designed to bring me back into compliance with their wishes. 3 months ago, that financial dynamic had taken an unexpected turn when my parents found themselves in serious trouble. Richard's latest development project, a luxury shopping complex called Ashford Commons, had hit multiple snags. Environmental concerns had delayed construction, 2 major anchor tenants had pulled out, and cost overruns had eaten through their reserve. Suddenly, the people who had always lectured me about financial responsibility were facing foreclosure on their beloved Willowbrook Estates mansion. That's when they had come to me hat in hand, asking for help to save their home and their reputation. It was the first time in my life that I had possessed something they desperately needed, and the power dynamic had shifted in ways none of us were prepared for. The conversation that had led to tonight's dinner had been building for 3 months, and the stakes had never been higher for any of us. Understanding this history makes what happened next even more shocking, because my parents were about to discover that their compliant, people-pleasing daughter had finally reached her breaking point. The crisis that had brought us to tonight's dinner began on a rainy Tuesday morning in February when my father called me at 6:47 a.m., his voice shaking in a way I had never heard before. "Isabella, we need to talk," he said, skipping his usual formal greeting. "Can you come to the house today? It's urgent." The desperation in his tone was so uncharacteristic that I immediately cleared my afternoon schedule and drove to Willowbrook Estates, my mind racing with possibilities of what could have rattled my normally unshakable father. When I arrived at their imposing colonial mansion, I found both my parents sitting at their formal dining room table surrounded by stacks of legal documents, financial statements, and what appeared to be several overdue notices. My mother's usually perfect makeup was smudged, suggesting she had been crying, and my father's hair was disheveled in a way that would have horrified him under normal circumstances. The scene was so unprecedented that I actually paused in the doorway, wondering if I had somehow entered the wrong house. "Sit down, Isabella," my mother said, gesturing to a chair across from them. Her voice was hoarse, and I noticed her hands were trembling slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "We need to explain something to you, and we need your help." What followed was the most honest conversation I had ever had with my parents about money, though it took nearly an hour for the full scope of their financial disaster to become clear. The Ashford Commons project, which was supposed to be my father's crowning achievement and their ticket to an even more luxurious retirement, had become a financial nightmare that threatened to destroy everything they had built over 30 years. The problems had started with environmental surveys that revealed contaminated soil from a former gas station that had operated on the site in the 1960s. The cleanup costs alone had exceeded $800,000, completely exhausting their construction contingency fund. Then the City Planning Commission had demanded additional parking structures to meet updated traffic flow requirements, adding another $1.2 million to the project cost. When their primary contractor had discovered structural issues with the existing foundation, requiring a complete redesign and rebuild, the budget had spiraled completely out of control. "We've already invested $3.8 million of our own money," my father explained, his usually commanding voice reduced to a defeated whisper. "The bank is threatening to call in the construction loan, and we've already leveraged everything we have as collateral. The house, our investment portfolio, even your mother's jewelry collection." My mother picked up the narrative, her social polish cracking to reveal genuine terror underneath. "If the bank forecloses on the project, they'll take everything. The house, our retirement accounts, even the car collection in the garage. We'll lose it all, Isabella. Everything we've worked for, everything we've built, it'll all be gone." The irony wasn't lost on me that these were the same parents who had spent years lecturing me about financial responsibility and conservative investment strategy. They had criticized my decision to start my own business as too risky while simultaneously gambling their entire net worth on a single development project. But seeing them broken and desperate triggered something deeper than vindication. It activated the protective instincts they had spent years cultivating in me as the family's designated problem solver. "What can I do to help?" I asked, though I already suspected where this conversation was heading. My father leaned forward, his businessman's instincts kicking in despite his emotional state. "We need someone to temporarily take ownership of the house, so the bank can't seize it as part of the business asset. Someone with good credit and a clean financial history who could hold the property in trust until we can restructure our debts and get back on our feet. We've talked to 3 different lawyers," my mother added, "and they all said the same thing. If we transfer ownership to a family member before the bank moves to foreclose, the house would be protected. It would just be temporary, maybe 6 months, maybe a year at most, just until we can resolve the business situation." The request hung in the air between us like a live wire. They were asking me to take legal ownership of their $1.8 million home, effectively making me responsible for their mortgage payments, property taxes, and any legal liabilities that might arise. It was an enormous responsibility that could impact my credit, my business and my financial future in ways I couldn't fully predict, but it was also the first time in my life that my parents had needed me more than I needed them. For 27 years, they had held financial power over me through their ability to provide or withhold support. They had used their wealth as leverage to influence my decisions, guilt me into compliance, and remind me of my dependence on their generosity. Now suddenly, they were the ones in need, and I was the only person in a position to help them. I'll need to review all the legal documents with my own attorney, I said carefully, and understand exactly what the risks and obligations would be. But if it would save the house and help you get through this crisis, then yes, I'm willing to help. The relief on their faces was immediate and overwhelming. My mother actually started crying again, but this time from gratitude rather than fear. My father reached across the table and gripped my hand with surprising intensity. "You're saving our lives, Isabella," he said. "We'll never forget this, never." Over the following weeks, I spent countless hours with lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors, making sure I understood every aspect of what I was agreeing to. The legal transfer was complex, involving multiple documents, insurance policies, and carefully worded trust, designed to protect both the property and my own financial interest. My attorney, David Chen, had been thorough in explaining the potential risk. "You're essentially becoming the legal owner of a very expensive piece of real estate," he had warned me during one of our meetings. "While the trust structure provides some protection, you'll still be responsible for making sure mortgage payments are made, property taxes are current, and the house is properly maintained. If your parents default on their obligations, you could be left holding a very large financial responsibility." But I had weighed those risks against the alternative, watching my parents lose everything they had worked for because of one failed business venture. Despite our complicated relationship, they were still my parents, and I couldn't stand by and watch them become homeless because of a series of unfortunate circumstances, largely beyond their control. The transfer was completed on a Thursday afternoon in March, with my signature officially making me the owner of 8 My Thud in Magnolia Drive, Willowbrook Estates. My parents had been grateful to the point of being emotional, promising that this was temporary, and that they would do everything in their power to resolve their financial situation as quickly as possible. "This changes everything between us," my mother had said as we left the lawyer's office. "You're not just our daughter anymore. You're our partner, our equal. We're going to treat you with the respect you deserve." My father had nodded enthusiastically. "No more treating you like a child. Isabella, you've proven that you're a mature, capable adult who can handle serious responsibilities. From now on, we're going to include you in all our major decisions as an equal member of this family." Those promises had felt genuine at the time, backed by the gravity of their situation and their obvious gratitude for my help. For a brief, shining moment, I had believed that our relationship was finally evolving into something healthier and more balanced. I had thought that their crisis had taught them to value my judgment and respect my autonomy. I should have known that people don't change their fundamental nature just because circumstances force them to ask for help. What I didn't realize was that my parents viewed my assistance not as a gift born of love and loyalty, but as evidence that I could afford to give them even more. In their minds, my willingness to help with the house wasn't proof of my generosity. It was proof that I had been selfishly hoarding resources that rightfully belonged to the family. Tonight's dinner was their way of collecting on what they now considered to be my debt to them, and they were about to learn that their newly empowered daughter was not the same compliant child they had manipulated for 27 years. In the 3 months following the house transfer, I threw myself into what I believed was a genuine partnership with my parents to help them rebuild their financial stability. This wasn't just about protecting their home anymore. It had become a comprehensive effort to restructure their entire financial situation and create a sustainable path forward. I genuinely believed we were working together as equals, just as they had promised, and I invested not just my time and expertise, but my heart and hope into making their recovery successful. Every Tuesday evening, we held what my father called family financial meetings at their house. My house, technically, though we all pretended that detail was just a temporary legal formality. I would arrive with my laptop, financial modeling software, and detailed spreadsheets analyzing every aspect of their situation. These weren't casual conversations over dinner. They were professional-grade business strategy sessions where I applied the same analytical skills I used with my consulting clients to dissect their problems and develop solutions. The scope of their financial chaos was staggering once I really dove into the detail. Beyond the Ashford Commons disaster, I discovered they had been living well beyond their means for years, maintaining their luxury lifestyle through a complex web of credit lines, investment account withdrawals, and refinancing schemes that had finally collapsed under its own weight. Their monthly expenses alone were $18,000, more than many families earned in a year, covering everything from the country club memberships to my mother's weekly spa appointments, to my father's collection of vintage cars that sat depreciating in their climate-controlled garage. I spent countless hours developing what I called the Ashford Recovery Plan, a comprehensive 18-month strategy that addressed both their immediate cash flow crisis and their long-term financial sustainability. The plan involved liquidating non-essential assets, renegotiating payment terms with creditors, downsizing certain lifestyle expenses, and ultimately completing the Ashford Commons project in a modified form that could actually generate positive return. My first recommendation was selling my father's car collection, which included a 1967 Mustang, a 1973 Porsche 911. These vehicles sat unused in the garage while my parents struggled to make basic debt payments, representing the kind of luxury they could no longer afford. When I presented this analysis complete with current market valuations and potential buyers I had already researched, my father's response was immediate and defensive. "Those cars aren't just investments, Isabella," he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I knew so well. "They're part of our family legacy. You can't put a price on sentimental value." The irony that he was lecturing me about the value of sentiment while asking me to risk my financial future for their house wasn't lost on me, but I swallowed my frustration and tried a different approach. Instead, I focused on restructuring their monthly expenses, identifying $6,800 in recurring costs that could be eliminated or reduced without significantly impacting their quality of life. This included downgrading their country club membership from premium to standard, switching to a more economical landscaping service, and canceling subscription services they never used. I even negotiated with their house cleaning service to reduce visits from 3 times per week to twice, saving them $400 monthly. The most significant part of my plan involved completing Ashford Commons as a smaller, more focused retail development. Through my business connections, I had identified a regional grocery chain that was looking for anchor space in Bellmont, along with 2 restaurant concepts and a fitness studio that would create the kind of neighborhood shopping center that could actually succeed in the current market. This revised approach would require an additional $1.8 million investment, but my financial projections showed it could generate positive cash flow within 14 months. To make this possible, I had spent weeks developing a comprehensive investor presentation that highlighted the project's potential while honestly addressing the previous failures. I had arranged meetings with 3 different investment groups, prepared detailed market analysis reports, and even secured preliminary commitments from the potential tenants. My plan wasn't just theoretical, it was a practical roadmap that could actually save their financial future. But the most important aspect of my involvement was the personal sacrifice I was making to support their recovery. Beyond taking legal ownership of their house, I had quietly been covering several of their monthly expenses to prevent additional damage to their credit rate. Their property tax bill of $3,200 had been automatically charged to my account. When their landscaping service threatened to terminate for non-payment, I had quietly settled the $1,000. Even their country club membership dues, which they claimed were essential for maintaining the business relationships necessary for their recovery, had been coming out of my checking account for 2 months. All told, I had personally invested nearly $47,000 of my own money into their financial recovery, not including the enormous risk I was taking by legally owning their home. This wasn't money I could easily afford to lose. It represented 6 months of my business revenue and a significant portion of my emergency savings. But I had convinced myself that this was an investment in our family's future and proof of the new, more respectful relationship my parents had promised. I had also been providing professional consulting services that would normally cost my clients too. The financial analysis, investor presentations, and strategic planning I was doing for them represented hundreds of hours of work that I was providing free of charge. If I had been billing them at my standard rates, My services alone would have been worth more than. Most importantly, I had been serving as an emotional support system for both my parents, as they navigated the stress and uncertainty of their situation. My mother called me almost daily, sometimes in tears, to discuss her fears about their future and her embarrassment about their circumstance. I had spent hours listening to her concerns, offering reassurance, and helping her maintain her emotional stability during the most difficult period of her life. My father, meanwhile, had been relying on me as his primary business advisor and strategic partner. He would call me before making any significant financial decisions, run his ideas past me for feedback, and even asked me to accompany him to meetings with lawyers and accountants. For the first time in my life, he was treating me as an intellectual equal rather than a child who needed constant guidance and correction. This new dynamic had been intoxicating. After 27 years of being dismissed and undervalued, I was finally experiencing what it felt like to be respected and needed by my parents. They listened to my advice, implemented my suggestions, and regularly expressed gratitude for my help and expertise. When my mother introduced me to her friends as our financial genius who's helping us through a difficult time, or when my father told his golf partners that I was the smartest business mind in the family, I felt a validation I had been craving my entire life. I had genuinely believed that their crisis had forced them to see me differently, not as the disappointing daughter who hadn't lived up to their expectations, but as a capable, successful adult who could be trusted with important responsibility. I thought we had finally moved beyond the toxic patterns of my childhood and evolved into a healthier, more balanced family relationship. The invitation to tonight's dinner had seemed like the natural next step in this evolution. When my mother called to suggest a special celebration dinner to discuss Isabella's expanded role in the family's financial future, I had assumed it was their way of formally acknowledging my contributions, and perhaps offering me some kind of official partnership in their rebuilt business venture. I had even allowed myself to imagine that they might want to make the house arrangement permanent, perhaps offering to sell me their equity stake at a fair market price, so I could truly own the property I was already responsible for maintaining. The idea of finally having something concrete and lasting from our new relationship had been incredibly appealing. What I didn't realize was that my parents had interpreted my willingness to help as evidence that I had been selfishly hoarding resources that should have been shared with the family all along. In their minds, my ability to cover their expenses and take on their house payments wasn't proof of my generosity, it was proof that I could afford to do even more and had been deliberately withholding support from them. Tonight's dinner wasn't a celebration of our partnership, it was an intervention designed to extract even more resources from the daughter they had decided was finally ready to pay her fair share. The first crack in my hopeful expectations appeared when my father dismissed my carefully researched Ashford Commons revival plan with a wave of his hand, as if I had suggested something trivial rather than presenting a comprehensive strategy that could save their entire financial future. "That's all very interesting, Isabella," he said, using the same tone he might use to humor a child's crayon drawing, "but your mother and I have been thinking bigger, much bigger." My stomach began to tighten as I recognized the shift in his demeanor. This wasn't the grateful, respectful partner who had been seeking my advice for months. This was the old Richard Ashford, the man who had spent my entire childhood dismissing my ideas before I had finished explaining them. But I pushed down my growing unease and tried to stay focused on the business discussion. "Bigger how?" I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. My mother leaned forward with the expression she always wore when delivering what she considered to be exciting news. "Well, darling, we've been thinking about diversification. Why limit ourselves to one real estate project when we could be building a real family empire? Your father has identified several other development opportunities around Bellmont, and with the right capital investment, we could establish Ashford Development as a major regional player." The waiter chose that moment to present the wine list, and my father made a show of selecting a $180 bottle of Bordeaux without consulting me about the choice. As we waited for the wine service, my mother continued outlining their grandiose vision with the enthusiasm of someone who had never had to worry about the practical details of implementation. "There's a beautiful tract of land near the lake that would be perfect for luxury condominiums," she said, her eyes lighting up as she described their fantasy. "And your father has heard that the old Riverside Mall might be available for redevelopment." Imagine transforming that into a mixed-use complex with residential units, office space, and retail. It would be absolutely transformative for the entire downtown area. I felt a chill of recognition as I listened to them describe projects that would require tens of millions in investment capital, elaborate financing arrangements, and years of complex development work. These weren't the modest, careful ventures that made sense given their recent financial disasters. These were the kind of ambitious schemes that had gotten them into trouble in the first place. Only now they were talking about pursuing multiple projects simultaneously. Those sound like incredible opportunities, I said carefully, but given what happened with Ashford Commons, wouldn't it make more sense to focus on completing that project successfully before taking on additional commitment? My father's expression darkened slightly, and I caught a glimpse of the impatience that had always surfaced when I questioned his business judgment. Isabella, you have to understand that successful developers don't think small. Yes, we had some setbacks with the Commons project, but that's exactly why we need to diversify our portfolio. You can't build wealth by playing it safe. The wine arrived, and as my father went through the tasting ritual with theatrical precision, my mother continued building their cake. The thing is, darling, opportunities like this don't wait around. The lakefront property has already attracted interest from 2 other developers, and the Riverside Mall situation is time-sensitive. If we're going to move on these projects, we need to act quickly. How quickly? I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this conversation was heading. The initial investment commitments need to be made within the next 60 days, my father said, settling back into his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had just outlined a brilliant strategy. We're talking about roughly $2.3 million to secure the development rights and begin the preliminary planning phases. The number hit me like a physical blow. $2.3 million. They were asking me to fund not just one additional project, but an entire portfolio of speculative ventures that made their original Commons disaster look conservative by comparison. And they were presenting this as if it were a reasonable request, as if my willingness to help them save their house had somehow established my obligation to bankroll their every entrepreneurial fantasy. That's a substantial amount of money, I said, trying to keep my voice steady while my mind raced through the implications of what they were asking. It's an investment in our family's future, my mother said, using the same phrase they had deployed when asking me to take ownership of their house. And with your business doing so well, we know you understand the importance of taking calculated risks to build long-term wealth. The casual dismissal of my own financial situation was breathtaking. They were talking about $2.3 million as if it were a minor expense, completely ignoring the fact that this represented more money than I had ever seen in my life, let alone had available for speculative investment. My entire net worth, including my business equity and the current value of my condo, was probably around $800,000. They were asking me to somehow produce nearly 3 times that amount for projects that had no guaranteed returns and significant downside risk. I don't have access to that kind of capital, I said, stating what should have been obvious to anyone who understood basic personal finance. My father waved away my concern with the confidence of someone who had never been told no by a bank officer. That's what business loans are for, Isabella. With your strong credit rating and the house as collateral, you could easily secure financing for the initial investments. Banks love to lend money for real estate development, especially when there's solid collateral backing the loan. The mention of using the house as collateral made my blood run cold. They were talking about leveraging the property I had agreed to protect for them, the home I was legally responsible for, as security for their new round of financial speculation. If these projects failed, and given their track record, failure seemed more likely than success, I would be personally liable for millions of dollars in debt, with their house as the primary asset at risk. You're asking me to mortgage the Willowbrook house to fund these development projects? I asked, wanting to make sure I understood exactly what they were proposing. Not mortgage, my mother corrected with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It's more like a strategic refinancing arrangement. The house has so much equity, nearly $1.8 million, and most of that value is just sitting there doing nothing. It makes perfect financial sense to put that equity to work, generating returns for the family. The way she described it made it sound like I was being fiscally irresponsible by not immediately agreeing to their plan. In their minds, the house wasn't just collateral I was protecting for them. It was a family asset that should be actively deployed to generate wealth for everyone. The fact that I would be personally liable for any debts secured by the property seemed to be a minor detail they preferred not to emphasize. I need to think about this, I said, though what I really needed was time to process the magnitude of what they were asking and figure out how to respond without destroying our relationship entirely. Of course, darling, my mother said with the kind of patient tolerance usually reserved for children who needed extra time to understand simple concepts. We know it's a big decision, but we also know that you're smart enough to recognize a good opportunity when you see one. My father nodded sagely, as if he were offering me sage wisdom rather than trying to manipulate me into risking my entire financial future for his benefit. The key thing to remember, Isabella, is that successful families build wealth together. Your grandmother always said that individual success means nothing if you're not lifting up the people you love. The invocation of my deceased grandmother, who had actually been one of the few family members who ever encouraged my independence, felt like a particularly low blow. But what really stung was the implication that my reluctance to immediately embrace their plan was evidence of selfishness rather than prudent financial caution. As our appetizers arrived, I found myself struggling to maintain the polite dinner conversation my parents seemed to expect while internally processing the realization that nothing had really changed between us. Despite all their promises about treating me as an equal partner, despite months of appearing to value my advice and expertise, they still saw me primarily as a resource to be extracted from, rather than a person with my own legitimate financial interests and concerns. The waiter refilled our wine glasses, and my father raised his in a toast to family partnerships and shared prosperity, he said with a broad smile that somehow managed to look both genuine and predatory at the same time. I raised my glass automatically, but the wine tasted bitter as I realized that the evening I had hoped would celebrate our new relationship was actually the beginning of the end of any illusions I had about my parents' capacity for change. As our main courses arrived, I made a conscious decision to try salvaging the evening by steering the conversation toward more realistic alternatives. Maybe my parents' grandiose development schemes were just initial enthusiasm, and we could work together to find a more practical middle ground that would satisfy their ambitions without destroying my financial future. After all, I had successfully managed their crisis for 3 months. Surely I could find a way to make this work too. I understand the appeal of diversifying into multiple projects, I said carefully, cutting into my herb-crusted salmon while choosing my words with diplomatic precision. But what if we took a more phased approach? Instead of committing to $2.3 million upfront, what if we focused on securing the lakefront property first, developed that successfully, and then used those profits to fund the Riverside Mall project? My father paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the man who had been asking for my advice over the past few months. That's actually not a bad approach, he said slowly, his business instincts overriding his immediate desire for everything at once. The lakefront property is only asking for a $400,000 development deposit, and the timeline for that project is more flexible. Exactly, I said, feeling a surge of relief that we might be finding common ground. And if we complete the Ashford Commons renovation first, we'll have a proven track record of successful project completion that will make it easier to secure favorable financing terms for the lakefront development. My mother set down her wine glass and leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine interest. You know, that actually makes a lot of sense. Patterson from the Garden Club was just telling me about her son-in-law's real estate ventures, and he always says the key is building success incrementally, rather than trying to do everything at once. For the first time since the conversation about their expansion plans had begun, I felt like I was talking to the parents who had spent the last 3 months treating me as a valued advisor rather than a source of funding. My father was nodding thoughtfully, clearly running calculations in his head, while my mother was asking practical questions about timelines and market conditions. The beauty of this approach, I continued, warming to the theme as I saw their interest, is that it allows us to test our assumptions with a smaller investment, before committing to the larger projects. If the lakefront development works out well, we'll have both the capital and the confidence to tackle something as ambitious as the Riverside Mall. And $400,000 is much more manageable, my father agreed, his voice taking on the collaborative tone I had grown accustomed to during our weekly planning meetings. We might even be able to structure that without using the house as collateral, maybe through a combination of personal loans and private investor partnerships. I felt a wave of optimism wash over me as I realized we might actually be finding a solution that could work for everyone. A $400,000 investment was still enormous by my standards, but it was at least within the realm of possibility, especially if we could structure it creatively through business loans and investor partnerships, rather than personal guarantees secured by real estate. I could probably arrange meetings with 3 or 4 potential investors, I offered, thinking of several wealthy clients from my consulting business who had expressed interest in real estate opportunities. And my attorney has experience structuring development partnerships that minimize personal liability while still providing access to necessary capital. My mother clapped her hands together with genuine delight. Isabella, this is why we're so grateful to have you involved in these decisions. You have such a practical way of thinking through complex problems. Isn't that right, Richard? My father nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely. You know, Isabella, I was telling George Martinelli at the country club just last week that you've become indispensable to our business planning. He was very impressed when I described the recovery strategy you developed for us. The validation felt intoxicating after the anxiety and disappointment of the previous hour. This was the relationship I had been hoping for, genuine collaboration between adults who respected each other's perspectives and worked together toward shared goals. My parents were listening to my suggestions, building on my ideas, and treating me like a valued partner rather than a stubborn child who needed to be convinced or manipulated. I could have a preliminary investor presentation ready by next week, I said, my excitement building as I outlined the next step. If we focus on the lakefront project first, I can leverage some of the market research I already did for the Ashford Commons revision to show comparable property values and demographic trends. That would be wonderful, my mother said warmly. And you know, this approach also gives us time to really think through the design and positioning for each project, rather than rushing into everything at once. Quality over quantity, as my mother always used to say. The mention of my grandmother felt entirely different this time, a genuine tribute to her wisdom rather than a manipulative attempt to guilt me into compliance. I found myself relaxing for the first time since the conversation about their expansion plans had begun, allowing myself to believe that we were finally operating as the kind of family I had always wished we could be. Our waiter appeared to check on our meal, and my father ordered another bottle of wine, not the most expensive option this time, but a respectable mid-range selection that felt more appropriate for a business celebration than a display of excess. The gesture felt significant, like a sign that he was genuinely thinking about practical considerations rather than just indulging his impulses. You know what I appreciate most about this conversation? My father said as the waiter departed with our wine order. It's that we're actually talking about this as a family business rather than just my personal projects. For too many years I made the mistake of trying to handle everything myself instead of recognizing the value of having trusted advisors. And trusted family advisors are the best kind, my mother added, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Isabella, I know we haven't always been the best at showing our appreciation for everything you do, but I want you to know how proud we are of the woman you've become. The way you've handled our crisis, the expertise you've brought to solving our problems, it's been truly remarkable. The compliment hit me harder than I expected, bringing tears to my eyes that I had to blink away quickly. This was what I had been yearning for my entire adult life, recognition from my parents that I was capable, valuable, and worthy of their respect. The fact that it was coming in the context of a business collaboration made it feel even more meaningful, like proof that they finally saw me as an equal rather than a dependent. Thank you, I said, my voice slightly hoarse with emotion. Working together it means everything to me. I've always wanted to be able to contribute something meaningful to our family, and knowing that my skills and experience can actually help solve real problems for people I love, there's nothing more satisfying than that. My father raised his freshly filled wine glass in another toast. "To the Ashford family business partnership," he said with a broad smile that seemed completely genuine. "May this be the beginning of many successful ventures together." We clinked glasses, and for a moment the restaurant seemed to fade away around us. I felt like I was finally experiencing the kind of family dinner I had dreamed about as a child: three adults who genuinely liked and respected each other, working together toward shared goals, celebrating both individual achievements and collective success. The feeling was so intoxicating that I almost forgot about the warning signs that had been accumulating throughout the evening. The casual dismissal of my carefully prepared recovery plan, the breathtaking financial requests, the assumption that I would simply mortgage my future for their benefit, all of that seemed less important now that we had found a path forward that felt collaborative rather than exploitative. But as I would soon discover, my parents' apparent reasonableness was just another manipulation tactic, designed to lower my defenses before they revealed the true scope of what they expected from me. The moment of genuine connection I thought we were sharing was actually the calm before a storm that would shatter not just our dinner but any remaining illusions I had about their capacity for genuine change. Our pleasant family business discussion was interrupted when my father's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it with mild curiosity, but then his expression shifted dramatically as he read the content. His face darkened, and he immediately showed the phone to my mother, whose eyes widened in what appeared to be panic. "What is it?" I asked, feeling a chill of foreboding as I watched them exchange worried glances. "It's from Gerald Whitman," my father said, naming his longtime business attorney. "He needs to see us tomorrow morning. There's been a development with the Ashford Commons situation." My mother's hand flew to her throat in a gesture of distress I had seen countless times during their financial crisis. "What kind of development?" "I thought everything was stable with the bank negotiations." My father's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from the same attorney. He answered immediately, stepping slightly away from the table for privacy, though his voice was tense enough that I could hear fragments of the conversation. Words like accelerated timeline, immediate action required, and significant exposure drifted back to our table, each phrase adding to my growing sense of dread. When he returned to his seat 2 minutes later, his face was ashen. "The bank has received a formal complaint from the environmental cleanup contractor," he explained in a voice that had lost all its earlier confidence. "They're claiming we've defaulted on the remediation timeline and threatening to file a lien against all project assets unless we provide an additional $650,000 in guaranteed cleanup funds within 72 hours. The number hit me like a slap. $650,000. In 72 hours. This wasn't part of any recovery plan we had discussed. This was a financial emergency that could destroy everything we had been working toward. "How is that possible?" I asked, my mind racing through the implications. "I thought the environmental cleanup was already funded and nearly complete," my mother answered, her voice shaking with barely controlled panic. "It was supposed to be, but apparently there's been some kind of miscommunication about the scope of work. The contractor is saying they need to dig deeper than originally planned because they've found additional contamination. They want full payment for the extra work up front, or they're going to abandon the project and file claims against us for breach of contract." My father was already pulling up documents on his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be legal correspondence with increasing agitation. "If they file that lien, the bank will have grounds to call in the entire construction loan immediately. We're talking about potential personal liability of over $4.2 million. The restaurant suddenly felt too warm, too small, too public for the magnitude of crisis that was unfolding at our table. Other diners were enjoying their meals in blissful ignorance, while my family's financial future was disintegrating over dessert menus and after-dinner drinks. "Can we challenge the contractor's claims?" I asked, though I suspected the answer based on my father's expression. "Gerald says we can try, but it would take months to resolve through litigation, and the bank won't wait that long. They want to see immediate action to address the environmental concerns, or they're pulling out of the entire project." My father's voice was taking on the desperate edge I remembered from our first crisis meeting in February. My mother leaned forward urgently. "Isabella, This is exactly why we need to move quickly on those other development projects. We can't afford to have all our resources tied up in one venture that could be destroyed by circumstances beyond our control. We need diversification now, not later. The irony was staggering. An hour ago I had convinced them to take a conservative, phased approach to their expansion plan. Now they were using a new crisis to argue that my cautious strategy was actually dangerous, because it left them too vulnerable to single project risk. But if we're facing a $650,000 emergency payment, I said, trying to inject some rationality into the rapidly escalating panic, doesn't that make it even more important to focus our resources on solving the immediate problem rather than taking on additional financial commitment? My father shook his head with the impatience of someone who believed I was missing an obvious point. You're thinking too small, Isabella. If we can secure the development rights for the lakefront and riverside projects now, we'll have assets we can leverage to solve the Ashford Commons problem. But those opportunities won't wait for us to resolve our current crisis. My mother nodded enthusiastically, as if my father had just outlined a brilliant strategy rather than a recipe for financial disaster. Plus, the sellers for both projects are motivated. Your father's contact at the lakefront property said they'd accept a significantly lower deposit if we can move quickly, maybe as little as $200,000 instead of the full $400,000. If we can present them with an immediate cash offer of $300,000 for development rights, they'll probably accept it just to avoid losing everything to their bank. I felt like I was watching a train wreck in slow motion as my parents convinced themselves that the solution to their financial emergency was to commit even more money to speculative venture. Instead of focusing their limited resources on solving the environmental crisis that threatened their primary project, they wanted to spread those resources across multiple additional risks. So you're saying that instead of finding $650,000 to solve the contamination problem, you want to spend $500,000 on development deposits for projects that might not generate returns for years? I asked, unable to hide my disbelief. We're saying we need to think strategically about building long-term wealth rather than just putting out fires, my mother replied with the confidence of someone who had never actually been responsible for making complex financial decisions work in the real world. My father's phone buzzed with another message, and his expression grew even more grim as he read it. Gerald wants us in his office at 8 a.m. tomorrow to review our options. He's saying that if we can't provide proof of access to the cleanup funds by Friday, he's recommending we file for bankruptcy protection before the liens and foreclosure proceedings begin. Bankrupt. The word hung in the air like a toxic cloud representing the complete failure of everything we had been working toward for the past 3 months. All my careful planning, all the money I had already invested, all the risk I had taken on by accepting ownership of their house, it could all be wiped away by environmental contractors who had apparently been incompetent or dishonest about the scope of work required. There has to be another option, I said, though I was already running calculations in my head and coming up with nothing good. Maybe we can negotiate with the contractor, or find a different company to complete the cleanup work. Isabella, my mother interrupted, reaching across the table to grab my hand with surprising intensity. There is another option. That's what we've been trying to explain to you. We don't have to be victims of other people's mistakes and mismanagement. We can take control of our situation by diversifying our investments and creating multiple revenue streams. The waiter approached our table with the dessert menu, but my father waved him away without looking up from his phone. The romantic dinner atmosphere that had briefly emerged during our conversation about family partnerships was completely gone, replaced by the harsh fluorescent reality of financial crisis management. The timing is actually perfect, my father said, his voice taking on the manic enthusiasm that always emerged when he was trying to convince himself that a risky plan would somehow work out. The lakefront and riverside opportunities are both time-sensitive, which means we can secure them at below-market prices. If we move fast, we can turn this crisis into the foundation for something much bigger and more profitable. I realized with growing horror that my parents weren't just asking me to bail them out of another financial emergency. They were asking me to double down on their failed approach to business by committing even more resources to even riskier ventures. They had learned nothing from the Ashford Commons disaster except that they needed access to more capital to make even bigger bets. The environmental crisis wasn't a wake-up call for them, It was just another obstacle to overcome on their path to building a real estate empire, and they expected me to provide the funding that would make their delusions of grandeur possible, regardless of the cost to my own financial future or peace of mind. The final straw came when my father set down his phone and looked at me with the kind of determined expression that had always preceded his most unreasonable demands. "Isabella, we need you to wire $115 million to Gerald's trust account by tomorrow morning." The number was so outrageous that for a moment I thought I had misheard him. "I'm sorry, what?" "1.15 million, my mother repeated clearly, as if the problem was my hearing rather than the insanity of what they were asking. "It covers the environmental emergency plus the deposits for both development opportunities. Gerald can structure it as a bridge loan secured by all 3 properties, which protects everyone's interests while we work out the long-term financing arrangement." I felt the blood drain from my face as the full magnitude of their demand hit me. They weren't asking me to help with a single crisis anymore. They were asking me to fund their entire expansion strategy using money I didn't have, secured by properties I would be legally responsible for if anything went wrong. "I don't have $115 million, I said, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. "I don't have anything close to that amount. My entire net worth is maybe $800,000, and most of that is tied up in illiquid assets." My father waved away my objection with the casual dismissiveness he had always shown toward inconvenient facts. "You don't need to have the cash sitting in your checking account, Isabella. That's what leverage is. The house alone has enough equity to secure a loan for that amount, and with your income and credit rating, any bank would be happy to structure a business development loan." The mention of the house, their house that I was somehow supposed to risk for their benefit, made my stomach lurch. They were talking about mortgaging the property I had agreed to protect, using my credit and income to secure debt that would fund their speculative ventures, and expecting me to take on personal liability for more than I could possibly repay if their plans failed. "You're asking me to mortgage the Willowbrook house to fund your business ventures," I said, wanting to make absolutely sure I understood what they were proposing. "We're asking you to make a smart investment in proven real estate opportunities," my mother corrected, her tone suggesting that my reluctance was evidence of poor business judgment rather than reasonable caution. "The house is just collateral, Isabel. It's not like we're asking you to give up the property, we're asking you to put it to work generating returns for the family." My father leaned forward with the intense focus he always brought to closing a deal. "Think about it logically, Isabel. If these projects succeed, and with your business expertise helping to guide them, they will succeed. You'll earn back that initial investment, plus substantial returns within 18 months. This isn't a cost, it's an opportunity." The restaurant around us continued its normal evening rhythm of clinking glasses and murmured conversations, but I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare where the people who were supposed to love me most were calmly explaining why I should destroy my financial future for their benefit. Every word they spoke made it clearer that they saw me not as a daughter or partner but as a resource to be exploited. And if the projects fail, if the environmental problems can't be solved, or the market doesn't respond to the developments the way you're projecting, or any of 100 other things go wrong, what happens to me then? My parents exchanged a look that seemed to communicate something I wasn't privy to, and then my mother reached across the table to pat my hand in a gesture that felt more condescending than comforting. "Darling, that's exactly the kind of negative thinking that holds people back from building real wealth. You can't succeed in business if you're always focused on what might go wrong instead of what could go right. Besides," my father added, "you wouldn't be taking on this risk alone. We'd all be partners in these ventures, sharing both the responsibilities and the rewards. This isn't about you funding our projects, it's about us building something together as a family." The gaslighting was so blatant that it took my breath away. They were asking me to put up all the money, take on all the legal liability, and risk all my assets, but they were framing it as an equal partnership where we would share rewards and responsibility. In their version of reality, my reluctance to mortgage my future for their dreams was selfishness rather than self-preservation. "What exactly would you and Mom be contributing to this partnership?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer would be infuriating. "Experience and expertise," my father replied immediately, as if he had been expecting the question. I have 30 years of real estate development knowledge and industry connections that money can't buy. Your mother has the social networks and community relationships that are essential for successful project marketing. Plus, my mother added, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, we'd be providing ongoing project management and oversight to protect your investment. You wouldn't have to worry about the day-to-day details of development work. You could focus on your consulting business while we handled the operational aspects of the real estate venture. It was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as generosity. They would contribute their expertise, while I contributed everything of actual value: the money, the credit, the legal liability, and the collateral. If the project succeeded, they would take credit for their superior knowledge and connections. If the projects failed, I would be left holding millions of dollars in debt, secured by property I couldn't afford to lose. The waiter appeared at our table with the check, and my father immediately slid it toward me with a smile that seemed almost triumphant. "This one's on you, partner," he said, as if we had already agreed to their outrageous proposal. "Consider it your first investment in our new family business venture." The casual assumption that I would pay for dinner after they had spent the evening trying to manipulate me into financial suicide was so audacious that I actually laughed, a short, sharp sound that had nothing to do with humor. The check was $3,507, which represented more money than I wanted to spend on a single meal, but it was also a tiny fraction of what they were asking me to risk for their benefit. "Actually," I said, reaching for my purse with movements that felt mechanical and disconnected from my emotional state, "I think I need some time to consider everything we've discussed tonight. This is a much bigger decision than you're making it sound like, and I need to review my financial situation and talk to my own advisors before making any commitment." My mother's expression immediately shifted to the wounded disappointment I remembered from childhood whenever I failed to immediately comply with their expectations. "Isabella, darling, we don't have time for extended deliberation. These opportunities are time-sensitive, and the environmental crisis needs to be addressed immediately. Sometimes in business you have to make quick decisions based on trust and family loyalty." "Family loyalty," I repeated, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "Is that what this is about?" My father's patience was clearly running thin, and his voice took on the sharp edge that had always preceded his angry lectures about responsibility and gratitude. "Isabella, your mother and I have invested everything in your success over the years. We paid for your education, supported your business dreams, and trusted you with our most valuable asset when we transferred the house to your name. Now we're facing a crisis that threatens everything we've built, and frankly, we expected more support from our daughter." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. After everything I had done for them over the past 3 months, the money I had invested, the time I had spent, the risks I had taken, the professional expertise I had provided free of charge. They were suggesting that I was ungrateful and disloyal for not immediately agreeing to mortgage my entire future for their benefit. That's when I reached the point where something inside me simply broke. I set down my napkin with deliberate precision and looked directly at my parents, feeling a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. "You know what? You're absolutely right about family loyalty. Let me tell you exactly what family loyalty looks like." My voice was steady, but I could feel something fundamental shifting inside me. The people-pleasing mechanism that had governed my behavior for 27 years was finally, completely breaking down. Family loyalty is spending 3 months of my life developing a comprehensive recovery plan to save your financial future. Family loyalty is taking legal ownership of your house so you wouldn't lose it to foreclosure, despite the enormous personal risk. Family loyalty is covering your property taxes, your landscaping bills, and your country club dues when you couldn't afford them. Family loyalty is investing $47,000 of my own money into your crisis without asking for anything in return. My mother started to interrupt, but I held up my hand and continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. Family loyalty is providing hundreds of hours of professional consulting services that would normally cost you $2. Family loyalty is attending every weekly meeting, analyzing every financial document, and treating your problems as if they were my own. Family loyalty is celebrating your successes and supporting you through your failures, even when you've never once acknowledged the sacrifices I've made for this family. My father's face was flushing red, and I could see the anger building in his eyes, but for the first time in my life I didn't care about managing his emotional reactions. But apparently, family loyalty isn't enough for you. Family loyalty doesn't mean working together as equals or treating each other with respect. Family loyalty means that I'm supposed to mortgage my entire future to fund your fantasies, take on debt I can't afford to pay back, and risk everything I've worked for so you can play real estate mogul with my money. The restaurant around us had grown noticeably quieter, and I realized that our raised voices were attracting attention from other diners. My mother was mortified by the public nature of our argument, constantly glancing around to see who might be watching. But I was beyond caring about appearances. "Isabella, lower your voice," my mother hissed, her social instincts overriding any concern for the actual content of my words. "People are staring. Let them stare," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the dining room. Maybe they need to hear what it sounds like when someone finally stands up to financial manipulation disguised as family loyalty. My father leaned forward aggressively, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You need to check your attitude, young lady. We are your parents, and we deserve your respect and support. Everything we've asked for is reasonable, and your refusal to help us is selfish and ungrateful." The word ungrateful was like a match thrown onto gasoline. After everything I had done, everything I had sacrificed, everything I had risked for their benefit, they were calling me ungrateful for not immediately agreeing to destroy my financial future for their convenience. "Ungrateful," I repeated, my voice rising again despite my mother's frantic gestures for quiet. "I'm ungrateful. Let me tell you what ungrateful looks like. Ungrateful is asking your daughter to take on $115 million in debt while contributing nothing but your expertise to the partnership. Ungrateful is treating someone who has saved your house and rebuilt your financial plan like an ATM that exists solely for your benefit." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, and pulled out my briefcase. Several nearby tables were now openly watching our confrontation. But I was past caring about social niceties or family embarrassment. Ungrateful is spending 3 months promising to treat me as an equal partner, then reverting to the same manipulative tactics you've used my entire life the moment you want something big. Ungrateful is making me feel guilty for protecting my own financial interests while you risk everything I own on projects that have no guarantee of success. My hands were shaking as I opened my briefcase and pulled out a manila folder that contained documents I had brought to tonight's dinner for entirely different reasons. I had planned to present them as part of our business partnership discussion. But now they would serve a very different purpose. "You want to talk about family loyalty and gratitude?" I said, placing the folder on the table with enough force to rattle the wine glasses. "Fine. Let's talk about it." I opened the folder and pulled out the deed to their house, the legal document that made me the official owner of 84-7 Magnolia Drive, Willowbrook Estates. The paper was crisp and formal, bearing my name as the sole proprietor of their $1.8 million home. But it had never felt as significant as it did in this moment. "This," I said, holding up the deed so they could both see it clearly, "represents the biggest act of family loyalty I could possibly offer. When you asked me to take ownership of your house to protect it from foreclosure, I didn't hesitate. I didn't demand anything in return. I didn't ask for guarantees or collateral or promises of repayment. I trusted you, and I put my own financial future at risk because I believed you when you said you needed help." My mother's eyes were fixed on the deed with an expression of growing alarm, as if she was suddenly remembering that their beautiful home legally belonged to someone else. Someone they had just spent the evening trying to manipulate and guilt into financial submission. "But apparently," I continued, "saving your house wasn't enough, covering your expenses wasn't enough, providing professional expertise wasn't enough. Now you want me to mortgage this property, the home I legally own and am financially responsible for, to fund your next round of speculative venture." My father reached across the table as if to take the deed from my hands, but I pulled it back and stood up straighter, holding the document against my chest. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice carrying a tone of authority I had never used with my parents before. "I'm going to pay for this dinner using this deed as collateral. since you seem to think my assets exist solely for your convenience. Then I'm going to walk out of this restaurant and think very carefully about whether I want to continue this relationship on terms that require me to sacrifice everything for people who see me as nothing more than a source of funding. The threat was deliberately ambiguous, but the implication was clear. If they wanted to continue treating me like a financial resource rather than a daughter, they might discover that financial resources could be withdrawn just as easily as they had been provided. My mother's face had gone completely white. Isabella, you can't be serious. You wouldn't actually what? I asked. Protect my own interests, set boundaries about what I'm willing to sacrifice for family, refuse to mortgage my future for people who have shown me nothing but disrespect and manipulation tonight. My father's business instincts were finally kicking in, and I could see him beginning to realize that he had pushed too far, too fast. Now let's just calm down and discuss this rationally. Rationally? I laughed. And this time the sound was genuinely amused rather than bitter. You want to discuss this rationally? Let's start with the rational observation that you just asked me to wire $1.115 million tomorrow morning for projects that might not generate returns for years if ever. Let's discuss the rational fact that you want me to take on debt that exceeds my entire net worth. Let's rationally examine the fact that you see nothing wrong with asking me to risk my home, my business and my financial future so you can continue living beyond your means. I walked around the table to where my father was sitting and placed the deed directly in front of him, making sure he could see every detail of the legal document that gave me absolute control over the property they considered their most important asset. This is what family loyalty actually accomplished, I said quietly. This deed represents trust, sacrifice and genuine love. But if you think family loyalty means I'm going to let you destroy my life for your benefit, then maybe it's time you learned what it feels like to lose the things you take for granted. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in my life I had left my parents completely speechless, and the power dynamic that had controlled our relationship for decades was suddenly irrevocably reversed. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in the middle of a restaurant confrontation, before my father found his voice again. But when he spoke, it wasn't with the authority and control he had wielded throughout my childhood. Instead, his voice was shaky, uncertain, and for the first time in my life he sounded genuinely afraid. Isabella, let's not do anything hasty here, he said, his eyes fixed on the deed in front of him as if it were a loaded weapon. We can work this out, we're family. We don't need to make threats or ultimatums. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. They had spent the entire evening making ultimatums and threats, demanding impossible amounts of money, setting artificial deadlines, leveraging guilt and family obligation to pressure me into compliance. But the moment I showed them that I had leverage of my own, suddenly they wanted to discuss things calmly and reasonably. Threats? I repeated, picking up the deed and holding it against my chest again. What threat? I'm simply pointing out that this legal document represents everything I've sacrificed for this family. If you think my willingness to help you means I'm obligated to destroy my own life for your benefit, then maybe you need a reminder of exactly what I have the power to do. My mother was frantically glancing around the restaurant, clearly mortified by the public nature of our confrontation. Several nearby tables had stopped their conversations entirely and were watching our drama unfold with undisguised fascination. A manager in a navy blazer was hovering near the hostess stand, clearly debating whether he needed to intervene in what was obviously a family crisis. Isabella, please, my mother said in a stage whisper that somehow managed to be both desperate and condescending. Not here. People are watching. Can't we discuss this privately at home? At home? I asked, and I couldn't keep the bitter amusement out of my voice. You mean at my home? The home that I legally own and am financially responsible for, the home that you want me to mortgage to fund your business fantasy. The correction hit my mother like a physical blow, and I watched her face crumple as the reality of their situation became clear. For months they had been living in a house that belonged to someone else, someone they had just spent the evening trying to manipulate and exploit. Their beautiful mansion, their symbol of success and status, was entirely dependent on the goodwill of the daughter they had been treating as a personal ATM. My father was clearly trying to regain control of the situation, But his usual tactics of intimidation and authority weren't working when I held the legal rights to everything he valued most. Isabella, you're being emotional and irrational. Let's go home and discuss this properly without an audience. I'm being emotional? I asked, my voice rising again despite the public setting. I'm being irrational. You just asked me to wire $115 million tomorrow morning for projects that exist only in your imagination. And I'm the one being irrational. I signaled for our waiter, who had been carefully avoiding our table for the past 10 minutes, clearly hoping our argument would resolve itself without requiring his intervention. When he reluctantly approached, I could see the professional mask of politeness covering his obvious discomfort with our family drama. I'd like to pay the check, please, I said, maintaining my composure despite the emotional hurricane raging inside me. Certainly, he replied, pulling the leather folder from his pocket. Will this be together? It will be on the house, I said, opening my briefcase again and pulling out a business card and a pen. I wrote quickly on the back of the card, then handed it to the waiter along with the deed to 847 Magnolia Drive. The waiter's eyes widened as he realized what he was holding. Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand. This is the deed to a property valued at $1.8 million, I explained calmly, loud enough for my parents and several nearby tables to hear clearly. I'm offering it as collateral for a $37 dinner bill, with the provision that my parents here arrange payment within 24 hours, or ownership of the property transfers to Marcello's restaurant as settlement for the debt. The restaurant had gone completely silent around. Even the kitchen noise seemed muted as everyone within earshot tried to process what they were witnessing. My parents looked absolutely horrified, not just by my actions, but by the public humiliation of having their financial dependence exposed in front of strangers. Isabella, stop this immediately, my father said, his voice carrying the sharp edge of panic rather than authority. You're making a scene and embarrassing our entire family. I'm embarrassing the family? I asked, genuinely incredulous. You spent 3 hours trying to manipulate me into mortgaging my future for your benefit, and I'm the one embarrassing the family. The waiter was still holding the deed, clearly unsure whether this was some kind of elaborate joke or a genuine legal transaction. Ma'am, I really think I need to get my manager. Please do, I said, and please explain to him that this is a legally binding document that gives me the absolute right to use this property as collateral for any debt I choose to incur, including dinner bills at fine establishments. My mother was actually crying now, but not from sadness or regret, from fury at having her social status threatened in such a public way. You can't do this to us, Isabella. We're your parents. We raised you. We loved you. Loved me, I repeated. And for the first time all evening, my voice broke slightly. This is what love looks like to you, demanding that I sacrifice my financial security for your convenience, calling me ungrateful when I won't immediately agree to take on debt that could destroy my life. I stood up and gathered my things, leaving the deed on the table between us like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. Here's what love actually looks like. Love is protecting someone from their own bad decisions. Love is setting boundaries to prevent people from destroying themselves and others. Love is refusing to enable destructive behavior, even when it means disappointing people you care about. My father made one last desperate attempt to reassert control. If you walk out of this restaurant without resolving this properly, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. You're destroying our family over money. I turned back to face him, and I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me, as I realized that his threats no longer had any power over me. I'm not destroying our family over money, Dad. I'm saving myself from a family that was destroying me over money. There's a difference. The manager had arrived at our table, a middle-aged man with the practiced calm of someone who had dealt with difficult situations before. Is there a problem here? No problem at all, I said, pulling a business card from my briefcase and handing it to him. I'm leaving the deed to my property as collateral for this dinner bill. My contact information is on the card. If my parents don't arrange payment within 24 hours, please have your legal department contact me about transferring ownership. I picked up my purse and briefcase, then looked one final time at my parents, who were sitting in stunned silence at the table where we had shared what I now realized would probably be our last family dinner. For what it's worth, I said quietly, I did love you. I still do, but I won't let that love destroy me anymore. I walked toward the exit with my head held high, ignoring the stares and whispered conversations from other diners who had witnessed the complete breakdown of the Ashford family's carefully maintained facade. As I reached the door, I heard my mother calling my name, but I didn't turn around. Outside in the warm Bellmont evening, I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing deeply and trying to process what had just happened. My phone was already buzzing with texts and calls, but I turned it off and dropped it into my purse. For the first time in my life, I had chosen my own well-being over my family's expectations, and the sense of liberation was both exhilarating and terrifying. I had finally learned what it felt like to walk away from people who claimed to love me but treated me like a resource to be exploited. And despite the pain and uncertainty that lay ahead, I knew I had made the right choice. 3 days passed before I turned my phone back on, and when I did, I found 107 missed calls, 89 text messages, and 34 voicemails from various combinations of my parents, their attorney Gerald Whitman, my brother Marcus calling from Nashville, and even several family friends who had apparently been recruited into their campaign to bring me back under control. The sheer volume of desperate communication attempts told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they were taking my actions at Marcello's. I was sitting in my condo's living room, looking out at the Riverside District's tree-lined streets while sipping my morning coffee, when I finally decided to listen to the voicemails. The progression told a story that was both satisfying and heartbreaking, tracking my parents' journey from outrage to panic to what sounded like genuine desperation. The first message, left just 2 hours after I had walked out of the restaurant, was pure Richard Ashford fury. Isabella, this is your father. Your behavior tonight was absolutely unacceptable, and you need to call me immediately to resolve this situation. I don't know what's gotten into you, but this tantrum needs to end right now. His voice carried all the authoritative anger I remembered from childhood, but underneath it I could hear something new, a tremor of uncertainty. By the fifth message, left the following morning, his tone had shifted dramatically. Isabella, please call me back. We need to talk about this deed situation. Gerald says, we need to clarify the legal implications of what happened at the restaurant. This isn't a game, and we need to work together to sort this out properly. The commanding patriarch was being replaced by someone who was beginning to understand that he no longer held all the cards. My mother's messages followed a similar trajectory, though her approach was more emotional manipulation than direct authority. Isabella, darling, I don't understand why you're doing this to us. We're family. Whatever problems we have, we can work them out without involving strangers and making public scenes. Please come home so we can talk like civilized people. Her voice was carefully modulated to sound wounded rather than angry, but I could hear the calculation beneath the emotion. The most interesting message came from Gerald Whitman, their attorney, who had clearly been brought in to assess the legal implications of my restaurant stunt. Ashford, this is Gerald Whitman. I need to speak with you urgently about the deed situation. While I understand you were making a point about your ownership of the Willowbrook property, the method you chose raises some complex legal questions that we should address promptly. Please call my office at your earliest convenience. But it was the message from my brother Marcus that finally convinced me to engage with the situation. His voice was tired but not accusatory, and he cut straight through the family drama to address the real issues. I said, it's Marcus. Mom and Dad called me in a complete panic about what happened at dinner. I've heard their version, but I know there has to be more to the story. I've been where you are, dealing with their financial manipulation and emotional blackmail. Call me when you're ready. I'm on your side, whatever happened. I called Marcus first and our conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. He had experienced his own version of our parents' manipulative behavior when they had tried to pressure him into abandoning his music career and joining my father's real estate business. When Marcus had refused and moved to Nashville, they had cut him off financially and emotionally, treating his career success as a personal betrayal rather than an achievement to celebrate. They never change, Isa, he said with the weary wisdom of someone who had been through his own family war. They just find new ways to package the same basic message, that your value as their child is directly proportional to your willingness to sacrifice your own interests for theirs. What you did at that restaurant was long overdue. Armed with my brother's support and perspective, I finally called Gerald Whitman to clarify the legal situation. Our conversation was professionally cordial but revealed some interesting information about my parents' actual financial position and their reaction to my action. Your parents are quite concerned about the implications of your demonstration at Marcello's, Gerald said carefully. While the restaurant manager was understanding about the unusual nature of the situation and has agreed to treat it as resolved, your parents are worried about what this incident says about the stability of their living arrangement. It turned out that my parents had already contacted Gerald about transferring the house back to their names, but had discovered that doing so would immediately expose them to the foreclosure proceedings they had been trying to avoid. The environmental crisis with Ashford Commons was still unresolved, and their creditors were becoming increasingly aggressive about collecting on outstanding debt. Moving the house back into their names would make it vulnerable to seizure, but leaving it in my name meant living with the constant knowledge that their home depended entirely on my goodwill. They're in an impossible position, Gerald explained. The house transfer was effective in protecting the asset from business-related foreclosure, but it also means they no longer have legal control over their most valuable possession. Your actions at the restaurant reminded them quite dramatically that their security is entirely dependent on your continued cooperation. I met with my parents 1 week after the restaurant incident, but this time it was on my terms, in my attorney David Chen's office, with clear legal boundaries and professional oversight. The difference in their demeanor was remarkable. Gone were the confident demands and manipulative guilt trips. Instead, they sat across from me looking genuinely humbled and uncertain. My father spoke first, and his voice carried none of its usual commanding authority. Isabella, we owe you an apology. We've had a week to think about what happened, and we realize that we've been treating you unfairly, not just at dinner but for months now. My mother nodded, though her agreement seemed more reluctant than his. We've been so focused on solving our financial problems that we lost sight of how our requests were affecting you. We never meant to make you feel like we only valued you for what you could provide financially. The apology felt genuine, but I had learned to be cautious about their ability to say the right things when their circumstances required it. I appreciate you saying that, I said carefully, but I need to understand what's actually changed about how you see our relationship, not just what you're willing to say to resolve this crisis. What followed was the most honest conversation I had ever had with my parents about money, family dynamics, and mutual respect. They acknowledged that their financial crisis had revealed problems in how our family functioned that went far beyond business decisions or investment strategy. They admitted that they had been using emotional manipulation and guilt to pressure me into financial arrangements that served their interests rather than mine. Most importantly, they agreed to completely restructure our relationship around clear boundaries and mutual respect. I would retain ownership of the house, but would transfer it back to them within 2 years, provided they successfully completed a financial counseling program and demonstrated sustained responsible money management. They would pay me market rate rent for the house and would treat any future business discussions as professional negotiations between equals rather than family obligation. The environmental crisis that had triggered their latest round of desperate demands was resolved through a much more modest approach than their grandiose expansion plan. They completed the Ashford Commons project as a smaller-scale retail development, sold it for a modest profit, and used the proceeds to stabilize their personal finances without taking on additional debt or risk. 6 months later, our family dinners are still somewhat awkward, but they're no longer battlegrounds where love is weaponized to extract financial concession. My parents have learned to ask for advice rather than demand compliance, and I've learned that setting boundaries doesn't mean ending relationships. It means making them healthier. The most surprising outcome has been my father's genuine respect for my business expertise. He now refers potential clients to my consulting firm and has become one of my most effective advocates in Bellmont's business community. My mother has enrolled in financial planning courses and has started managing their household budget with impressive competence. They'll never be the warm, unconditionally supportive parents I wished for as a child, but they're learning to be adults who can maintain respectful relationships with other adults, including their daughter. And sometimes, that's enough. If you're watching this and recognizing yourself in my story, whether you're the family member being pressured to sacrifice your financial future for others' dreams, or whether you're the person using family loyalty to justify unreasonable demands. Know that healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, not emotional manipulation. Love doesn't require you to destroy yourself for other people's benefit. And family doesn't mean you're obligated to fund other people's irresponsible decisions. Setting boundaries with people you love is one of the hardest things you'll ever do, but sometimes it's the only way to save both yourself and the relationship. When you stop enabling destructive behavior, you force people to change or reveal their true priority. Either way, you'll know where you stand. Has anyone else ever had to use dramatic action to reset toxic family dynamics? Share your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about family boundaries, financial manipulation, and finding the courage to choose your own well-being over other people's expectations. Remember, the people who truly love you will respect your boundaries, not punish you for having them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.